This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. What does the Browns' big board look like? We've talked about what I like. We talked about what y'all like. We talked about what other people like. But what does that Browns' big board actually look like? Well, we're going to take a guess at it. We're going to talk about some things that could happen and just really take this time to talk about some prospects that I think are interesting, will fit great for the Cleveland Browns. We'll break this down into different rounds. And we're just going to talk about it. It's a great time to talk ball, to be honest with you. All right, so we're going to talk about second round guys who I think are on the radar for the Cleveland Browns. Now, some of these guys might be out the reach of the Cleveland Browns, but if they fall to a certain point, maybe the Browns consider trading up for them. Some of these guys might be there at 54. They might not have to do anything for it. So my out of reach guys that they would have to trade up for are Marius Mims. He's likely going to go in the first round, but he is super raw, only has 8 games of tape, and his ankles, his medicals aren't great. So that's a recipe for a player who might fall. If he does, I could see the Browns wanting to get that upside guy as a possible replacement for Jedrick Wills in a couple of years, well, in a year or two once his contract is up. Has great athleticism, has the traits, won in the SEC when he was out there, just the issue is the amount of tape, and his medicals aren't great. Another guy who, look, I'm not the biggest fan of this player, but I'm not talking about what I would like. I'm talking about why the Browns would go after him. And I do think if Xavier Worthy falls to like 45 or something like that, that the Browns would consider trading up to go get him. This is just the type of receiver that the Browns like to draft. You know, they love to get those undersized guys who can move and have that X factor of what they can do with the ball in their hands. They're not really interested in those bigger body receivers that I like. They like guys like Xavier Worthy, and Xavier Worthy is probably what people wanted Anthony Schwartz to be. I think he's closer to Marquise Goodwin than he is to Tyreek Hill, but I still think he'll be a productive NFL player. Don't think he'll be any more like he's more, you know what he is? He's kind of like Hollywood Brown. Like, I will put him in that Hollywood. Let me rephrase that. He's closer to Hollywood Brown than Tyreek Hill. But he's in that range. Now, I mean, they could have just signed Hollywood Brown, so I don't know why they would do it. This is not a pick I would love, a trade up I would love, but it's definitely something the Browns could do. Ja'Tavion Sanders, we're talking more about who the Browns would take in the second round. So Ja'Tavion Sanders is somebody they would take. I think Roger Rosengarten is in that conversation. But Kieran Amagaje is in that conversation. I think Kingsley Sumatia is in that conversation as well. Keon Coleman is the guy that I would take at 54 if he's there, because I think he's going to be a great pro. But we'll see if the Browns take him. While he does fit all of the Browns' RAS profiles, all of the Browns, age profiles that they like to follow when it comes to the draft, they just haven't drafted a lot of dudes like Keon Coleman, and I worry about that. I worry about them getting spooked because of the 40 time. To me, I'm not spooked because of his 4.6 40 time, just because he has a great broad jump and he has a great 10-yard split on his 40. And that tells me that he's explosive, that he's going to be able to separate in short areas. And I think that's honestly more important to me for a wide receiver to have than long speed. I think long speed only happens every once in a while. But a lot of, like, Amari Cooper does not have 4.4 long speed anymore. But what he still has is that quick burst ability. So he gets open all the time and he scores long touchdowns all the time. That's what I think is more important at wide receiver. I think we make too much of 40 times and not enough of those 10-yard splits, not enough of those broad jumps, because what that broad jump is telling you is how much explosiveness can that player create with their lower body. And that's a 10-foot broad jump is pretty impressive. So That's more or less what I care about. He can create a lot of explosiveness out of a giant frame, and he has shown that he can play football at a high level in college. So I'm a Keon Coleman guy. I would love to go Keon Coleman. Michael Hall is somebody who's certainly in that conversation. I thought he had a good Senior Bowl, really electric player, super quick, twitchy kind of guy at that defensive tackle spot. The kind of defensive tackle that the Browns love to take. But there's going to be a number of interesting prospects that could be there at 54. This is just a sample of them. Let's talk about guys who are third round prospects. I think the Browns are going to trade up from 85. Like, that's my gut feelings that they're going to trade up from 85. Karan Amagaji from Yale is another guy that makes sense to kind of jump up and get. But if you're sitting at 54, you're probably looking at like a Keon Coleman. You're probably, if you're going to take a tackle, looking at Kingsley Suamataia. And you're looking at prospects like that, right? Xavier Worthy. If Armarius Mims takes an incredible fall, you can trade up for one of those two guys, Xavier Worthy or Armarius Mims. Jatavion Sanders might be somebody you look at in the second round as well. But that's kind of where you would cast your net. There are some guys who I look at as strict, hey, if you're picking at 85, they're there and it makes sense. You would go at, like, Christian Jones is on my list there. He's a tackle from Texas. I think he has excellent tape. You turn on the tape and you see an NFL player, right? He has good feet, good hands, good technique, good player. Sometimes he gets beat inside, but I think he does a good job adjusting when that happens and not getting beat. I saw him at the Senior Bowl. He played left side. He looked fine. He played right side. He looked great. So I think he's a guy who can go left and right. That's always important to see. So you see that stuff with him. You can go left or right. If you can't get your hands on Roger Rosengarten, who I would covet a little bit more than him, just because he's younger, he fits your profiles a little bit better, and there's more potential with the athlete like him to be better in run blocking, where Christian Jones might be a little bit limited in that area. But Christian Jones, definitely somebody I see as a prospect the Browns should be very interested in. I would take him in that third round, 85 spot. Ben Sinnott is another tight end prospect, kind of like an H-back / fullback / kind of guy. Not going to be a dedicated one tight end like, some Jatavion Sanders has the potential of being, but still a good tight end. Somebody I would also consider moving up a little bit from 85 to take is Ruke Orhorhoro. He is an excellent run defender. We've talked about this. The Browns, if they need something at defensive tackle, they need more of a run defender, but we know that the Browns covet those those pass rush specialists at the defensive tackle positions. That's why I don't really anticipate them going really hard for somebody like Ruke Orhorhoro, but I think Ruke could be somebody who could be really, really, really useful to the Cleveland Browns. Maybe even in year one, he can get some playing time, not a ton, but in year 2, 3, once you have to move off of guys, especially like a Dalvin Tomlinson, who's your primary run stuffer, he could be somebody who could step in and kind of fill that void. So those are the guys that, like, hey, if they're available in the third, fourth round, maybe you trade up in the fourth to get, maybe you trade into the fourth round to get one of these guys. Maybe you trade up in the third, or maybe you just sit there at 85, take your pick and go on with that. But those are the guys that I would be interested in that kind of a packet. And then once we get to the fifth round, I think it's important to have a conversation at this point. After the fifth round, and honestly, after about halfway through the fifth round, I would say pick 160. After pick 160, the Browns pick, I think, at 157. I think the Browns are going to have a hard time finding guys on their board that they would deem rosterable. And if that's the case, they should probably try to get out of this draft after pick 160. I know people say 6th, 7th rounds important, and sometimes it is, But this draft for the Browns, it's just not a deep enough class. There's already limitations on this class, given that it's like a COVID year class. So there's some guys who are like 25. The average age in this draft class seems to be 23 and a half, which is almost outside the guardrails of the Cleveland Browns. Like, it's just not a great draft class for the Cleveland Browns. So I would imagine after pick 160, like I would think the Browns would want to make 3 or 4 picks before 160. And if those are the 3 or 4 picks that they make in this draft, I think they end up being fine with it. But that being said, who are those guys in that conversation that I still think the Browns would find rosterable that might be taken in day 3 or at least the first round of day 3? I think you got Christian Jones there. Again, he could be somebody who can go in the second round. He could be somebody who can go all the way as late as the 4th or 5th round. So you want to keep your eyes on him. I think Joe Milton becomes a distinct possibility more in the 6th than the 5th. But like, I think that does become a possibility. I am not a fan of Joe Milton as a prospect. I think he's too old to be as raw as he is. I know people compare him to Anthony Richardson, but Anthony Richardson was like 19 years old when we were evaluating that tape. Like, everything we saw of Anthony Richardson was as a teenager. Joe Milton, everything we've looked, he's a grown ass man at 23, 24 years old. So don't really get the upside play. I don't think you get to be 24 years old entering a draft class super raw and get to talk to me about upside, because if all it took was time and coaching for you to get better, it would have happened by the time you were 24, so I don't really buy it as an upside pick. But what he is somebody who does fit what the Browns want to do at quarterback more than DTR. I still would think that DTR is a better prospect than him. But if that's how the Browns feel, I can ultimately understand it. And I think that that's something that they will consider this late in the draft. Keith Randolph is a nice defensive tackle prospect that I like. Had a solid Senior Bowl. I think he could become a solid role player on a defensive line. Somebody who could eventually be rosterable. He might be, and a lot of these guys I'm going to mention, they might get cut once or twice before they become rosterable players, but the potential is there for them to be rosterable. Isaiah Davis, running back out of South Dakota State, kind of fits the profile of what the Browns like. Again, not somebody I expect to make the team, maybe makes the practice squad, maybe doesn't, but gets brought back eventually down the line in a couple of years. You're talking about a guy who can actually hold down a roster spot. Javon Cohen is a guard out of LSU. No. Javon Cohen is a guard prospect. Yeah, Javon Cohen is a guard prospect out of Miami. Super raw, but was able to win with his raw talent in Miami. I mean, not just at Miami, but also at the Senior Bowl. Again, somebody who's going to be on and off your roster, going to be on the practice squad, going to get cut, picked back up, kind of a fringes guy, might even spend a year in the UFL. But ultimately, I think the tools are there for him to become rosterable. Bo Limmer, I think it's good. I think Bo Limmer is actually like good. I would draft him with intent to keep him on the roster. So Bo Limmer, he's a center/guard prospect. He played all three interior positions at the Senior Bowl. Saw good enough stuff there. Had a moment where T'Vondre Sweat completely ran him over, but also had a moment where he held his anchor really strong against T'Vondre. And I like somebody who can get beat, gets back up, battles back. And that's kind of what I saw from Bo at the Senior Bowl. And I would think he would be worth a draft pick, especially in the 5th or 6th round. And I think Bo can eventually become a good player for you, whether that be a rotational guard, kind of replace what Michael Dunn used to do for the team, or maybe somebody who can just hold it down at guard long term. I think there's some potential there for him. T'Vondre Sweat is another guy who would be worth a draft pick. I know he's going to fall in this draft. He's had a horrible pre-draft process, but I think ultimately he's a very talented player. He's definitely the most talented nose prospect. I don't understand why the Browns would draft him, given that he doesn't fit what the Browns want. I've seen Andrew Berry draft defensive tackles. I've seen Jim Schwartz push for Siaki Ika. It don't make sense, but Jim Schwartz's system, it's more geared towards like a Michael Hall or a Ruke, a Ro. Not really a T'Vondre Sweat, but then you see Jim Schwartz go on a limb to draft somebody who fits the profile of T'Vondre Sweat. So you wonder, like, do they like that? And if your plan is, hey, let's see if he can slim down, like I think there's a better chance of that happening with T'Vondre, given the fact, well, regardless of the fact that he didn't lose weight in this process. But I think there's a chance of it happening because I don't think if Siaki Ika slims down, he's a great athlete. I do think that if T'Vondre Sweat slims down, he's actually a great athlete. So there's a lot of potential there. There's a good NFL player in T'Vondre Sweat. The question is, can you get it out of him and what needs to happen? I don't really think he needs to play at like 320 in order to be successful. I think he can live at 360 and be a successful NFL player in the right defense. I just don't know if the Browns are the right fit for him, but I do think they'll be interested in the 5th round. McKinley Jackson is also somebody who, look, he might make the roster, he might not, but you know, he might eventually become a good rotational player down the line. He's definitely going to be a camp favorite. This dude plays hard, like great motor. He's going to bull rush guys. He's going to look incredible against third teamers and in preseason. But I think he's going to struggle to make the roster because he's a nose tech that's not big or long, and that's an issue for him, right? So definitely not going to get rostered by anybody, but I would think that he can be a rotational piece for a lot of teams in the long run, but he's going to have a long ride to get there. My 6th, 7th round guys, Gabe Hall, kind of a similar thing where he fits like the physical profile of what you want at that position. He's just not a great athlete, real stiff with his hips, doesn't move great side to side. He's kind of like what if Alex Wright was a little bit less athletic than Alex Wright is. There's a world where he can get on the team, get some things cleaned up, and become a productive player for an NFL team, but I don't think that that's where he is right now. AJ Barner is another guy who could eventually become a good blocking tight end. I think he needs a couple of years bulking up on practice squads before he can be that. Trevor Keegan is a guard prospect that I like. Delmar Glaze is another guard prospect that I like. Again, not gonna be on the roster, or at least active on game days in year one, but will be on the practice squad and eventually could become a good backup piece for you. I have some UDFA recommendations for the Cleveland Browns. Charles Turner III out of LSU. The tape at LSU is not great. The tape at the Senior Bowl is much better. You have to figure out which player he is. Was he just out of position? Was it really Jaden Daniels and how he operated the pocket that made a lot of issues for him during the football season? But I think he can be a good guard. I think the athleticism is there. Same thing with Ladarius Henderson out of Michigan. A lot of potential there. I thought the tape was fine with him and the Senior Bowl was fine with him, just not spectacular, right? Nothing you want to spend a draft pick on, but I think there's some potential there to be a good, solid NFL player. Brevin Spann Ford, he's just old, right? 25 years old, coming out of college at Iowa State, but I think he has potential to be a good blocking tight end. I think he has potential as a receiving tight end. He's somebody I can see replacing Jordan Atkins down the line if things go right. Obviously, he's going to be an undrafted free agent, but I think he's somebody that would be worth that UDFA push. Frank Gore Jr. is also another guy that I'd be interested in. Jalen Carlisle is another guy, and Josh Proctor is another guy. Yeah, so those are two guys that I think they would be interested in at the safety position. Again, I don't know if the Browns make a ton of picks after 160. I would think that their goal is, hey, can we make 5 picks before 160? If that's the case, then I think the Browns would be interested. I also think you should look for the Browns to trade back anywhere from 55 to 62. Right. I think that's the sweet spot for the Cleveland Browns. They'll try to find a trade in that area. If they can't, then they won't. But I don't think it's going to be to pick up more picks. I think it's just going to be to move up in the rounds that they do have. I don't think this is a team looking for a ton of selections in this year's draft. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. You have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.